Welcome to Judaism Demystified, a podcast for the perplexed. Join us as we explore some of the most fascinating Jewish and Torah-related topics with our esteemed guests. By tackling some of the biggest questions you likely won't find addressed elsewhere, we aim to shed light on important issues and inspire a return to the fundamentals. Enjoy the show. Thank you for joining the Judaism Demystified podcast. You're a student of Rav Nahum Rabinovitch, alav shalom, who was also a formative teacher of Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, alav shalom. What was it about Rav Rabinovitch's approach that most shaped you, not just methodologically, but in terms of your overall worldview? And why does his way of thinking still resonate so deeply with you?
That's a great question. And the answer is, when I came to Ma'ale Adumim, many will say that people come to Ma'ale Adumim for Rav Sabato, and they would stay for Rav Rabinovitch. And the reason for that is that his way of thinking about really anything went beyond what a normal observer would see. Meaning, especially when you're learning Rambam and things like that, there's a level of what's written, what the sources say, and what the external meaning of them is. But then there's what's not being said and what's being hinted at and what you need to think deeply about to really understand. And Rav Rabinovitch was that. He would always be two, three, four steps ahead of you, just in his train of thought, and his ability to do that, to think deeply beyond what's written and to understand why people are saying things, what they're trying to get at, what the actual goal of what they mean is. It was enchanting. It was unbelievable. That's just the tip of the iceberg, though. With him, just like with any great individual, I think, he brought to the table a very clear, a very well thought out, and a very deep worldview, um, which was really very much the Rambam worldview, which is a deep understanding of reality and of philosophy, connected with a deep understanding of Torah, and those two together, and not in any sort of tension. Meaning, what am I trying to get at? That a lot of learned individuals will often be in one of two fields, right? They'll either be in a sort of academia, philosophy, science, and humanities, um, and things like that, or they'll be in Torah. And Rav Rabinovich's ability to have a breadth of knowledge, which was really breathtaking, and to demand of his students the same rigor and the same breadth and the same depth of thought, for me was very formative. That's what brought me to Rav Rabinovitch. I think Rabbi Sacks actually, in one of his short videos about Rav Rabinovitch, said that there was no field of thought that he didn't know something about, and there were many that he was an expert in. And that, as a student, which is a side I think a lot of people didn't see it of him, but as a student was very challenging. A lot of people, when they gave eulogies for Rabinovitch, and they spoke about his impact on them, talk about how kind and caring and really deeply loving individual he was. And he really was all of those things. But for me as a student, he was demanding. He demanded that when you ask him a question, you learn the sugya. When you made comments to him, you didn't just make offhand comments that weren't based on anything. You thought about things first. You gave them the proper respect. You learned and studied the sources that needed to be studied. And when I would speak to him, I would sweat from the back of my thighs, the back of my calves and thighs, which is strange. You don't normally sweat there, right? Like it was nerves. I was nervous. Um, I had a yirat kavod that literally just came from his demand for excellence. And that's what really stays with me, overall. That, and of course there are individual subjects in which he had an impact on me, but I think beyond any and all of that, it was his personality, it was his demand for excellence, it was his um, um, being a personal example of combining various worlds. He didn't see them in various intellectual worlds. He didn't see them as in any sort of tension. And those are things that I try to bring to my students, people I learn with, the people I teach, and I try to bring them this, first of all, the same demand for excellence, but also just the natural integration of human wisdom with Torah wisdom. And I think those two things together are are what should shape what should shape not only the Jewish people, but humanity going forward.
Beautiful.
Very well said. Very well said. It's something we need a lot more of in today's Jewish climate.
Mhm.
Fantastic. Okay. Your book, Kakhol HaYam, am I saying that correctly?
Yeah, absolutely.
Grows very naturally out of that intellectual world. A deep commitment to Rambam, paired with a willingness to rethink assumptions about tradition, authority, and leadership. When you began writing this book, what problem were you trying to solve? What did you feel was missing, and how Rambam is usually understood today?
So those are two sort of separate questions, and they're both interesting. I didn't set out to write this book, which is interesting. I happened to be learning the Shorashim in the Sefer Mitzvot, and specifically in the second Shorash of Sefer Mitzvot, the Rambam talks about how to classify dinim that Chachamim learn from the Psukim. And there are various views on that. And as I was studying and going through the various views, I didn't find anything that I liked, which is, again, if we want to go back to Rav Rabinovitch, this is part of who he was. Rabbi Sacks tells a story about him quoting a Khatam Sofer, and then Rav Rabinovitch saying, you did an excellent job quoting the Khatam Sofer, but you missed some important kushiot that make the din the exact opposite. And he said this about the Khatam Sofer, which is unbelievable. And he would always say this. He would say, okay, that's lovely, but what do you think about this? You're quoting sources, ask questions. And when you read through the literature on that particular issue, which I imagine we'll get into a little bit as we progress here, but as I was reading through the issues, I wasn't able to find any sort of explanation that made sense to me. And I actually wrote an article that was between 30 and 50 pages in length, which ended up being the first 3 chapters of my book. And I wrote it entirely from beginning to end 5 times. And in each of those 5 times, there were various changes that were made, meaning each version had several subversions. And as I was developing this thought about what the Rambam meant in this particular shoresh, I sort of realized how stuck within a certain frame of thought everyone is. Meaning, again, this is very, very abstract. So I'll explain the sugya a little bit, just so you guys can understand what exactly I mean. The Rambam says that dinim that Chachamim learn from the psukim are derabbanan. Okay, and there are various opinions as to what this means. The Ramban took this to mean that anything that Chachamim learn in drasha is derabbanan, which is through the Talmudic literature patently false, meaning there's no way for that to actually be the case. And so what ended up happening was you had 2 camps develop. One that said, no, the Rambam didn't actually mean it was derabbanan, he meant it's actually deoraita, but it's not counted as one of the mitzvot. That's one camp. Another camp that sprung up later amongst, it may have a support amongst Rishonim, but certainly sprung up later and was taken to an extreme by more modern scholars, was that the Rambam was making a specifically incongruous statement, meaning he knew that it wasn't true in the Talmudic literature, but wanted to set apart any of the dinim which are part of the Torah as a unit, which in the words of one scholar is a garin kashiach, right? A seed which cannot be touched or influenced by anybody, which is what was given to Moshe at Sinai, and only that would ever be considered din Torah, only that would ever be considered deoraita, and everything else would be derabbanan. And so as I was learning this, I said, well, the Rambam obviously can't ignore the Talmud, right? That's not what he does, on the one hand. On the other hand, to reinterpret this shoresh as saying pretty much the opposite of what the Rambam is saying, which also demands that we reinterpret various phraseologies in the Mishneh Torah in a way which is very, very, very tendentious, made me think, well, there must be some other option. The formulation that I came to, which we'll get to again a little bit further on, is that the Rambam essentially understands that there are 613 mitzvot, which was given to Moshe Rabbeinu at Sinai. But then what you have is various dinim, which, if you would take them, if you would look at them, they look like new mitzvot. They look like new rules that Chachamim are coming up with beyond what the Torah says, on the one hand, but on the other hand, aren't dinim that were given to Moshe at Sinai. So that meant that those dinim, the question is how to relate to those dinim, meaning there are many dinim that are learned out through drashot, which are details of the mitzvot, and there are many dinim which are not details, but somehow related or connected to the mitzvot, and those would be the Rabbanan. An example of this would be brachot rishonot, right? Why we make brachot before we eat, which is a drasha. It's a svara in the Gemara. There are various views of whether it's a drasha. The Rif actually brings that it's both a drasha and a svara, but it doesn't matter. It's a completely new institution which was learned from psukim and not a takana, not something that Chachamim said this is entirely unrelated and we're making a new rule, but something that through learning the Torah and through understanding what God wants from us, we are going to decide that this should be the din. That's just sort of, again, a very quick summary of where I'm coming from. But the problem I was trying to solve was very local. What ended up happening was, as you get into various sugyot about Chachamim and about the Torah, about things that were given to Sinai, and about the rules that we have nowadays, you get into other various sugyot. For instance, an example. The Rambam in many places in the Mishnah Torah talks about dinim that are divrei Kabbalah, which doesn't mean Kabbalah as it's meant nowadays, obviously in modern parlance, but dinim that were given sometime in the past. And again, the various views developed as to how to explain what the Rambam means by divrei Kabbalah. Does the Rambam mean dinim that were given to Moshe at Sinai, or does he mean dinim that have some sort of shorish in the past, right? Something was given by Beit Din, but then the question would be asked, so why do you call it divrei Kabbalah? That would just be a regular din that Chachamim learned. And various sugyot sort of develop one after the other. There's another famous question in the Rambam is that he says that we are obligated to keep any rules that Chachamim come up with because of lo tasur, and because of v'asita kakhol HaYam, right? Two mitzvot, mitzvot aseh, mitzvot lo taseh. And so the Ramban famously says, well, if every derived is a lo taseh and aseh, then every derived is more stringent, is more problematic than a deraita. And again, various schools of thought grew up around each of those. And so as I sort of rolled from sugya to sugya, you realize that there are many issues that are all sort of interconnected, right? They're all sort of based on how the Rambam understands the relationship between the Torah, what was given at Sinai, what we have from what was given at Sinai, and the rules and the authority that the Chachamim have to interpret and to add on to that. Okay? And so that essentially became the fundamental backbone of my book of various chapters, some of which are technical examinations of phraseology in the Mishnah Torah. Some of them are actually deeper and have philosophical dimensions to them. For instance, the din of lo tasur has philosophical dimensions to it, right? How do we understand what's the jurisprudence behind our obligation to do what Chachamim tell us to do? Why do we have to do it, right? The Ramban says we have to just because we have to. He doesn't give a good reason. Whereas the Rambam says, well, we have to because it's a mitzvah. Well, if it's a mitzvah, then why is it any different from any of the other mitzvot? And all these questions sort of came up one after the other, and that turned into the book. It just sort of happened because as I got into each sugya one after the other, it became clear that they had one subject, and it was worth giving them a sort of broad and interconnected treatment. That's the one part of your question. The other part of your question, which is what do I feel is missing and how the Rambam is usually understood, is, again, the Rambam is usually put into a box. This gets back to where we started with Rav Rabinovitch. The Rambam is usually put into a box of what's familiar. Okay, and it's important to really to understand exactly what I mean.
Preconceived notions, you mean?
Precisely.
Yes.
It's not only it's preconceived notions which come from the way other schools of thought within both Judaism and academia and philosophy understand things. Meaning, if I'm a modern individual, okay, and I've studied Kant and Descartes, okay, I will naturally interpret the Rambam in that way, even though he's an Aristotelian philosopher.
You're going to project.
Right. They're different worlds.
Appropriate.
Yeah.
Precisely. And Talmidei Chachamim are not free of the herding effect, right? The herding phenomenon, which is that opinions will almost always be closer to one another than to the truth. There's an interesting study done by Daniel Tversky, which is that he and Daniel Tversky, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, I think the two of them together did this. They studied predictions in, I think, the stock market. I might be wrong, but the predictions were always closer to one another than they were to the truth, assuming that the predictions were aware of each other, which is a classic herding effect. And what you end up having is that, okay, if the Ramban and Rashi and the Tosfot and et cetera, all understood things in a certain way, then when I come to study the Rambam, I'll immediately take these frames of thought and apply them to the Rambam. And one of the most important things when it comes to learning anything, but especially when it comes to learning the Rambam and when it comes to learning generally individuals who think differently, is to allow yourself to think differently and to think differently radically, to say things that are radically different from what other people are saying, and for a moment leave behind your own framework, your own patterns of thought, your own ways of doing things, and just let them say what they're saying. You can decide whether or not you think they're correct afterwards, but you have to, and I think this is very applicable to studying the Rambam, is the Rambam, for instance, when learning a halakha in the Mishnah Torah, it's important to first learn the halakha in the Mishnah Torah and then learn the Gemara. Meaning, even if I've learned the Gemara, I've learned the Rishonim, when I learn the Rambam, when I study what the Rambam is saying in the Mishnah Torah, and Rav Rabinovitch was very adamant about this, is what's he saying? What do the words in the Mishnah Torah mean by themselves without any relationship to what's actually said in the Talmud?
Right,
After you've decided,
because the Talmud is going to have its own herd effect, which is already going to
precisely
affect how you're reading
how I'm
the
reading the
Torah.
Talmud.
I
Exactly.
got you.
And then, so what I need to do is read the Mishnah Torah, and then, okay, this is what the Rambam is saying. Okay, now let's go back to the sugya and try to understand it without these preconceived notions of what I think is trying to say. And often for me, what that does is that actually allows me to get to a better and deeper understanding of what the Talmud is trying to tell me, because there are various issues and questions that were answered in certain ways by certain Rishonim, and they become common parlance, right? They're the accepted way of thinking about things, and you don't rethink what's actually being said, and then you see something different. You're like, okay, this is different. I need to go back and read this more carefully. I need to see, well, maybe there's a different way of reading the text. Maybe these answers aren't the best answers that could be given, et cetera, et cetera. And that allows you to sort of to break free of those notions. Just a last sentence about this. I was told a story by one of the Avrechim that worked with Rav Rabinovitch on the Yad Pshuta, his commentary on the Mishnah Torah, and he gave some explanation for halakha, which was very simple, but no one had said it to that point. It was unique. It was radically different, but it was powerful. And so the Avrech said, well, nobody said this before you. So there are various authorities who talked about the sugya, and you're coming and you're saying something completely different. Like, what's going on? Like, why was no one else able to say this that you are? And you know who else asks a similar question and gives a similar answer is Shaul Lieberman in the Tosefta, says that when you give a radically new interpretation, you have to explain why nobody thought of what you're trying to say.
Mm-hmm.
And what Rabinovitch said is that the Achronim were geniuses, but they often thought in a circle, meaning they were running the same course. And sometimes you need to just leave the entire stadium and think in a totally different way, and that allows you to get to new conclusions. And I think that's very, very important when studying the Rambam.
Fascinating.
Beautiful.
Beautifully said. So, okay, so one of your central claims is that according to the Rambam, any law derived through the 13 hermeneutical principles is fundamentally rabbinic, even when it appears indistinguishable from biblical law in the Talmud, which we touched on a little bit. Right. What does this force us to rethink about how halakhic authority actually works? And why do you think later tradition resisted this Rambam so strongly?
Right. So that does tie back into what we were saying.
Yeah.
First of all, I want to be exact about what the Rambam is saying. What the Rambam is saying is that in order to understand whether any given halakha is biblical law, is derived, or is rabbinic law, you must first distinguish whether or not that halakha is explaining what the law means or is innovating a new law. And I'll give an example. I'll give a general example, which is taken from general jurisprudence, and I'll give an example of a halakha like this. Generally, in law, you can have interpretation. You can have I don't know what the word would be. You can innovate law. And interpretation would be if I have a law that says or a regulation that says I'm not allowed to have vehicles in any parks. Okay, so there would be a legal discussion whether or not an electrical bicycle is a vehicle, or a bicycle is a vehicle, right? Or a tricycle is a vehicle, or et cetera, right? They would probably say, look, a tricycle is not a vehicle, right? A bicycle is probably not a vehicle either, because when we say a vehicle, we probably mean a motor. Okay, so we would say that electric bicycles and electric scooters are going to be vehicles, and they're not allowed in parks. Okay, great. Now, what about any of these in a schoolyard? Okay, well, a schoolyard isn't a park, right? And so the law obviously wouldn't apply to schoolyards. But any reasonable individual would say, okay, well, if you're not allowed to have um, vehicles in parks, then it's a kal v'chomer that you're not allowed to have vehicles in schoolyards, right? So the definition of what a vehicle is would be interpreting the law, and forbidding individuals from having vehicles in schoolyards would be a new law, which is based upon the previous law. Yeah.
One question. So Kal Chomer has an apparent logical deduction to it. What about, but how would you apply that to other hermeneutical principles, which are hermeneutical principles
Right.
that don't have that sequence of logic?
I'll get back to that. That's a good
Okay,
question,
cool.
and I'll
Okay.
get back to that. It's a good example because there's a good halakha that I was thinking.
It's an easy. Yes, I understand. It's
Yeah.
a good way to pave into it.
Right, but that's a great question. I'll get right back to that. But the example of the halakha that I would bring is there's a Gemara that talks about the need to constantly touch your tefillin while you're wearing them. Okay, and it's learned about kal v'chomer from the tzitz. The tzitz, which only has one azkara, you're not allowed to forget about them. The kal v'chomer, the tefillin, which has 37 azkarot, you can't forget about. And so what do we do? 26, 37, 37, whatever number it is, many more than one. You're not allowed to forget about, so therefore you must regularly touch your tefillin. Okay, so this deen obviously isn't in the Torah anywhere. It's not a law that God has commanded me. God has not commanded me to regularly touch my tefillin so I don't forget about them. What he has commanded is not to forget about the tzitz. Okay, and the Chachamim said, okay, well, if he's told you not to forget about the tzitz, he's told you that obviously you should not forget about your tefillin. But this is a law that Chachamim have innovated, and so it's their law. Okay, I'll give you another example, which is an interesting and good example. Is the Torah says that relatives are not fit to testify, right? But those relatives are only male relatives. The Rambam says that only male relatives are also derived, but not male relatives. Relatives from the father's side. Obviously, only males can testify in Jewish courts, but relatives from the father's side. Relatives from the mother's side are not. The Gemara says, "Ein achva min ha'im." There's no relationship that comes from the mother's side, which was based on, which was most likely based on familial structure in the time the Torah was given, which was that a woman who married somebody would join her husband's family, and so her family would be irrelevant to the new unit's children or the new unit's family. Later on, as family structures changed, etc., and as society changed a bit, it came to a point where it likely came to a point where that changed a little bit, and Chachamim decided that relatives from the mother's side are also not fit for edut. And the Rambam says these are derabanan. These are not biblical law, but rabbinic law. And the reason for that is that the Torah said that only male relatives are not allowed to testify. Female relatives are not male relatives. And so, relatives from the father, relatives from the mother are not relatives from the father, and so therefore they are not included in the Torah law, but they're included in rabbinic law. So that's an example of what you asked, which this isn't a kal v'chomer. It's a comparison.
Correct.
It's a reasonable comparison. And the 13 hermeneutical principles it's very important to understand the way the Rambam understands them. For the Rambam, they are proofs to something other than themselves. Okay, in the classic literature around drashot, there are two ways of looking at drashot. One of them is a drasha mekayemet, and one of them is a drasha yotzeret. Okay, what would be the difference? A drasha mekayemet would be not an inference, but a drasha. I don't want to use the word inference because inference is what's being supported. But I'll just call it a drasha. Drasha, which is supporting something that we know, right? Something that was given to us at Sinai. And the other one would be a drasha, which is innovating a rule. Because we made this drasha, we now have this new law. I think that academic way of thinking of things is mistaken when it comes to the Rambam, because all law is one of three things, okay? Either an explicit law given to Moshe, Baal Peh, right? Orally, or a law given to Moshe written in the Torah, or a law derived from reasonable thought, and a general svarot, which can be a kal v'chomer, which I mentioned before, which can just be a reasonable comparison, right? Another example of reasonable comparison is how many edim do we need to testify that a woman's husband has died in order to allow her to remarry, okay? There are two ways of looking at this. One way of looking at it is that it's isurim, just like any other isur, right? I only need one witness to tell me that this piece of meat was slaughtered properly in order to be able to eat it, right? But as Chachamim pointed out, there's an element which is similar to monetary issues in marriage, which is you have a kinyan, you have the rights to a certain relationship with this particular woman, and she's not allowed to have this relationship with other people, and so it's similar to monetary issues. And so you have a common drasha, davar shebe'eva mi davar shebe'mamon, because it says al pi shnayim edim yakum davar, and the davar is a monetary matter. And so Chachamim made this comparison between monetary matters and matters of marriage and things like that. And the question is, okay, what should the ruling be in this case where we're discussing a man who's died? Well, on the one hand, it's isur. On the other hand, it's similar to money. And they decided that because we don't want women to be able to be stuck in a situation where their husband is dead, but they're unable to be remarried because there's a lack of proper testimony to that. So they made the rules for testimony relatively lenient. Again, that's Chachamim deciding that something is reasonable. Okay, any rule like that, which is based on reasonable thought, I will then go to the Psukim in order to try to find a proof text for it. Okay, the way the Chachamim learned any of the drashot are as a proof text. One more example, which will help make things clearer, is that there's a disagreement between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon, if I'm not mistaken, about whether or not wild animals, you're allowed to eat wild animals with milk, okay, from the Torah. The halacha is that from the Torah they are allowed, and the Chachamim learn that they're not. And there are, in the Mishnah, there are two drashot, one by Rabbi Akiva and one by Rabbi Tarfon. And each of these they're not interpreting, the drasha is not designed to explain is not designed to explain the meaning of the words. What it is, it's a proof text and the hints hidden in the psukim to one reading versus another reading. The word gdi, right? Lo tavashel gdi b'chalev imo. What's gdi mean? Does gdi mean anything with a mother's milk, or does it mean specifically a domesticated animal? Okay, so one view says lo tochal three times, so that means one, if I'm not mistaken, one lema'et, whatever. The one drasha and Rabbi Akiva has a different drasha. Sorry, Rabbi Tarfon has a different drasha, and so neither of these drashot are specifically interpreting the pasuk, but each of them are proof texts within hamikra mechukam, as Rambam called it, that allows me to say, here, look, you have these extra words, you have this particular phraseology which points to this. But what we're doing is we're always doing a drasha mekayemet. We're always using the principles, the hermeneutical principles, to support something else, either a reading in a text, or an understand a comparison between two different dinim, or a din which was given to us by Moshe Rabbeinu from Sinai. And in each case, the proof text, the way the proof works, is identical, which is what the Rambam means when he says that there's no way of looking at a drasha and knowing whether the din is a biblical, a deoraita, or a derabanan, because the proof texts are always the same. Sometimes they'll be proving something which was given through the Masoret from Moshe Rabbeinu, and sometimes they'll be proving a reading in a pasuk. In those two cases, it'll be biblical law because they're both what Moshe Rabbeinu is telling us from God. And the other one will be, and sometimes it'll be supporting a comparison or a thought that Chachamim had in order to innovate a rule. And so that will be drabanan. The proof, the type of proof given will be exactly the same. The underlying rule will be different based on the relationship between what was given at Sinai and the rule itself.
Right. So you're saying that the mechanism used cannot be used as a decider whether it's derabanan or deoraita because
Precisely.
it can be used for both.
Precisely.
One
And sorry, just to cut you off for 1 second. And what you as an individual trying to understand whether any specific deen is deoraita drabanan is understanding whether this rule is interpreting what the Torah is telling us or innovating something in addition to what the Torah has told us.
right. So in the
Okay?
former, the drasha is being used to establish what is already been decided upon. So it's
Mhm.
establishing using the drasha the law that has already been set. It's establishing it further using a drasha to kind of I don't
Put a
know,
bow on it.
put a bow on it or
Yeah,
something
to
like that.
support it. Yeah.
To support it. In the latter, so I'm just picturing this in a judicial way. If you have
Mhm.
now Rabbi Kiva and you have Rabbi Talfun, and they're sort of going back and forth regarding something that is within the realm of innovation, and this
Right.
has to get voted upon by the Beit Din, right?
Okay. Yeah.
I'm assuming, right? It has to be voted upon
Yeah.
Beit Din to get to the conclusion. So would it be accurate to say that these proof texts are used to persuade?
Yeah, I think they probably would be used to persuade. So
Because
I'm
it's
pulling up the Mishnah. It is uh hang on.
if there's a Beit Din and they are entangled in this back and forth regarding this
Right.
new din, so the proof texts is would therefore would be persuading the other members of the Beit Din as to how to who gets the who gets to come out with the correct innovation.
Yeah. Sorry, so it's Rabbi Kiva, Rabbi Yosef Glida. I thought it might be. I just wanted to check.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry.
You can
I was
tell
just
my
wondering if that goes with what you were saying, or am I going?
so that's actually an interesting question. And I've thought about it. I thought about it a bit, but and I'll give you. I'll let you. I'll let you in on an example that I've thought of, and you can tell me what you think.
Sure.
There's a lot of disagreement today about surrogacy.
Sorry,
Okay.
surrogacy. Okay.
There's surrogacy.
Yeah.
On the one hand, it allows individuals who are unable to have children through various means the ability to build a family, which is fantastic. It's very important. It's a value that we have. On the other hand, it disconnects between motherhood and pregnancy, and it creates real issues with bonding between parents and their children. It may have long-term societal effects. It may create a caste of women who are sort of slaves to have children for others. And and there are various ways of thinking about this, right? The Torah says in Parashat Bereshit, "Alken Yazov ish et aviv et imo v'davak b'ishto v'ayu levasar echad." Okay, I am firmly against surrogacy, even with all of the various because of the various issues attached to it, and despite the fact that it has definitely positive sides to it, because of the fear of disconnect between motherhood and pregnancy, taking a biological child away from its mother who went through pregnancy with it, and the bonding problems that causes later on, etc., etc. And so I would read that pasuk as saying, "Al ken az Yazov ish et aviv et imo v'davak beishto v'ayu levasar echad." Right? Only derech dveka beishto, and not through a various process. And then you would say, okay, what about IVF? And then you could say, davak ish beishto v'ayu levasar echad, not beisha ela beishto,
It's still
ishto
as
mikol
well.
makom.
Yeah.
Right? That was a classic drasha. Okay, would that convince somebody who disagreed with me on the moral level or not?
No.
Probably not, right? They would find a different way to read the pasuk.
Yeah.
And so what I think, first of all, that's a really, really, really good example of a din derabanan, which because the Torah doesn't say anything about surrogacy because surrogacy wasn't a thing, right? Didn't exist. But what it does for me and what it does for the law in general is that it gives it roots in the Katuv.
I see what you're
It
saying.
connects it to the Torah given at Sinai, and it gives it a retzef. It gives it a
Continuum.
a continuum from Moshe Rabbeinu to us, which is very which in especially in law is very important. Law needs to be needs to
Alive.
feel and on the one hand alive, but it also needs to be connected to the
Grounded.
past.
It has to
It
be
needs to be
grounded.
grounded, precisely. The alive part is the given. I'm looking for the groundedness. It needs to be
Right.
grounded in the past. It needs to be grounded in authority. And so I think that's more the goal. I think that's
I
more the
see.
goal.
So, okay, I see what you're saying. You're saying that
And what I want
persuasion.
to yeah, continue.
Yeah,
Sorry.
no. I'm echoing what you're saying. I understand your rebuttal in the sense that persuasion off of how to learn a pasuk is usually not going to be a deciding factor when the factor is already disassociated from the pasuk per se.
Right.
I
So I'll give
understand
you,
what you're
so if you want to go back to the Mishnah, it's actually a good example. Go back to the Mishnah that I mentioned before about basar chaya b'chalav. So I have it here, so I'll read it to you. Rabbi Akiva omer, chaya ve'of eina min haTorah. שנאמר לא תבשל גדי בחלב אמו. 3 פעמים. פרט לחיה ועוף ולבהמה טמאה. So it says 3 times לא תבשל גדי. So each time it takes off something else. One time it takes off chayot. One time it takes off off. One time it takes off non-kosher animal. That's my dad in the background.
Hello.
And Rabbi Yosef Glili reads the pasuk differently. It says לא תאכלו כל נבלה ונאמר לא תבשל גדי בחלב אמו. Right there in the same pasuk. עד שאסור משום נבלה, אסור לבשל בחלב. עוף שאסור משום נבלה, יכול יהיה אסור לבשל בחלב. תלמוד לומר בחלב אמו. יצא עוף שאין לו חלב אם. Meaning, so he reads the juxtaposition between the psukim to say anything that has a nevela, that has a non-kosher version of it, is within the law, and that obviously includes wild animals. Are either of these, neither of those would convince the other, okay, first of all. And second of all, neither of those is a direct interpretation of Lo Tavashel Gdi B'Chalev Imo. What they are doing is supporting a reading of Lo Tavashel Gdi B'Chalev Imo. Do I read Lo Tavashel Gdi B'Chalev Imo meaning any animal which has chalav im, any animal which has a mother's milk? Or do I mean any domesticated animal? Because a gedi is a domesticated. Do I mean any domesticated animal? And that's underlying greeting going on. Rabbi Kiva, what do you mean? A gedi is a domesticated animal. So the Torah talks about domesticated animals, and we have no reason to assume it means anything other than domesticated animals. Whereas Rabbi Yosef said, what do you mean? It means any animal. It's just an example of an animal with chalav im, which would be reasonable and easy to eat. So that's what we're talking about. And then they use the drashot to connect what they're saying and give it a grounding in other aspects of the written word. That's how I think the Rambam understands drashot, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay. Beautiful.
And you asked why later tradition resisted this also.
Yes.
Oh yes, you're right. Oh yes, very important.
Please. Why did later tradition resist it? I think later tradition resisted it mostly because they didn't understand what the Rambam was saying. The Rambam has no, that's wrong. The later tradition resisted it because they made a different distinction from the Rambam. And I think it's important to understand the distinction. The Rambam's distinction is that there needs to be a clear line drawn between what God commanded and what the Chachamim commanded, even if the Chachamim viewed themselves as interpreting God's will. Okay? Meaning the Rambam is saying the only thing that can ever be the law in an absolute sense is what God said. Okay? Whereas anything else is of a different level. It's of a different type of obligation to keep it. And the other view is, am I interpreting what God wants in a given situation through the Torah, or am I adding my own laws? Chachamim in Takanot are according to all views, they're adding their own laws. Okay, they're saying this is a law that God did not command. I'm commanding you to light Hanukkah candles. I'm commanding you to read the Megillah. I'm commanding you to do Netilat Yadayim. All of these things are completely disconnected from what God commanded in the Torah. But if I'm studying what God commands in the Torah, and I say, well, if God told me not to have vehicles in parks, well, He certainly doesn't want me to have vehicles in schoolyards. Okay, then since I'm interpreting God's will, this is well, this is God's will, right? I'm interpreting this is what God wants from me, and I know it's what God wants from me because I'm basing it on what's written in the Torah. And since I'm basing it on what's written in the Torah, then it's a Torah law. And I think that the Rambam's distinction is a little bit more
Nuanced.
exacting. It's a little bit more saying that no, I think a different way of putting it. I think what the Rambam is saying that anything that you're told to do by a learned and wise individual is God's will. Okay, God's will extends to doing everything that is positive and will make the world better in general. It will make things in the world work better and act better and be better. But not all things God wants are law. Okay, the Rambam's interpretation is very jurisprudential. It's very legalistic and very exacting, and it says God wants all of the good things. God wants everything that improves existence. Okay, and well, there are different ways of knowing that. A parent can tell their child what to do, and that can absolutely be God's will. Okay, and a a secular ruler can tell what to do, and that can absolutely be God's will. And in Chachamim interpreting the Torah can tell what to do, and that can absolutely be God's will. Okay, but the clarity in which God's will was given to Moshe, word by word, whether in the Kabbalah or whether in the written Torah, is of its own level, and that's what we signed at Sinai, right? That's what Mushba'im v'Omdim al Sinai. That's the law, and anything that's not that and its interpretation is necessarily of a different level. And so any law that Chachamim are innovating is by definition of a lower legal level than everything else. Whereas for the Ramban or the other Rishonim, well, if they're innovating it through an act of interpretation, whether or not that's interpreting the law itself or creating new laws through interpreting God's will as it comes through in the psukim, well, then since I'm interpreting God's will, then that's the Torah. And the only time it would be derived is I'm explicitly not interpreting God's will, but creating a new law. And I think the distinction that the Rambam makes, the legalistic aspect of it, is sort of what was either not understood or being resisted. Does that make sense? That distinction between two days we're looking at things?
I'm thinking about it. So you're saying that for Harambam, the distinction is clear in that innovation is a lower legal level than the Doraita.
Right.
Yet, okay. So what you're saying that the detractors would say that God's law would not be. So it's the detractor side which I'm confused about. If you can help me out with that.
So what they're saying is that any time I'm interpreting what's written, but I'm using what's written in the Torah, I'm interpreting God's will. And since I'm interpreting God's will, not necessarily God's law, but God's will, this is now God's law because I have the authority to do so. Okay? And I'm interpreting what God means by these words and adding new laws through them, okay? Then that is an interpretation of God's will, which means it's on the same level.
So you're saying that the detractors would say that the Chachamim are an extension of the divine will.
Yes, absolutely.
Whereas Rambam draws that boundary.
Right, and I think that the Rambam draws it because, like I said, all of existence and existence working properly and according to the way it should be working is God's will. Okay, and we need legal distinctions to understand the way I need to relate to that. Much of God's will, what God would want me to be doing in any given situation, doesn't obligate me legally. Okay, there's a difference between what a perfect individual would do and what I must do legally. Okay, a perfect individual would, all of his midot would be b'derech emtza. He would only be doing things because he understands that it's the good and right thing to do. He would love God fully, and et cetera, et cetera. All of these things are excellent things to strive for. Okay, but they don't necessarily bind me legally at any given moment.
Although
okay?
the Rabbanan does bind us legally.
Precisely, and right, but it binds. That's exactly the point. So when Chachamim are adding new law, okay, that's great. That's perfectly within their authority to do so. But that law isn't the law that God gave. It's a new adjacent law which comes out of the law that God gave, which is connected to the law that God gave, which has roots in the law that God gave, but isn't the law that God gave. So since everything existing in a positive way would be God's will, the legal distinction is necessary to understand how I need to relate to that. Must I do it? Should I do it? Is it a good idea to do it? Should I refrain from doing it? Must I refrain from doing it? Those levels are legal distinctions which are necessary for running a society. Because you could say, just like in any society, you have norms, you have manners, you have regulations, you have laws, etc., etc. All of these things are connected, right? Norms and manners are part of a continuum which reaches regulations and laws. But regulations aren't laws, and norms and manners aren't regulations or laws, and manners aren't norms.
Can I try to rephrase it in a way that I would
Sure, absolutely.
just for myself?
Yeah.
When I do that, I do it for myself, and then you can correct me. So
Mhm.
I think what you're saying is that whereas those that oppose this understanding see everything as an extension of the divine will, Harambam would see the divine will in a sense split into two. What I mean by that is that there is the absolute law, and then there is law as it relates to society, which in essence, society being a world of conventions, always
It's always changing.
it's always
It's
changing.
relative.
It's always relative, and it needs that human input in order to draw that down correctly.
I don't know. I don't know if I would phrase it that way. Maybe I'll attack it from a different angle, which might help.
Because you were mentioning how society needs it. That's
Yeah.
what right. Meaning,
I'll try to make the point a little bit differently. The Rambam says that no nevuah can give law other than Moshe Rabbeinu's nevuah. Okay, he says this in the
right,
Nevuchim.
right.
That none of the Avot gave law, none of the other Nevi'im would ever give law. They would only say, do Moshe's law. Why? Right? Why can't Avraham Avinu give us law? Okay. And the reason for that is that divine law is a particular thing. I'll take another step back. Any law, okay, any society has law. Part of society is that it needs laws and norms in order to be able to function. Laws and norms always have goals. They always have a certain type of individual as the best type of, whether or not the law wants to acknowledge that fact or not. Any law sort of it creates societal norms, it creates desires and wills and ways of being which are preferred to other ways of being. And the reason that only Nevuat Moshe Rabbeinu can give God's law is because any intermediary which gives the law is adding human interpretation of things, which is similar to what you said. But I want to quibble with one point is that even in God's law, there is an element of interpretation because I need to interpret the law itself, which is the distinction I made between derived and derived at the beginning, right? I need to understand what a vehicle means. God tells me not to bring vehicles into parks.
Right. In essence, at the end, everything is interpretation.
Right. So there's definitely an element of interpretation, but there is also an aspect of like you said, society changing and well, I may need at a particular point to add a law, to take a law away. The Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim says that God knew that the law he gave would occasionally need additions or subtractions. And so what he did was he made it usher to add or subtract, except for Beit Hadin HaGadol, which can add takanot, and they can do Harat Shah when they need. And that's the point, is that these laws are responding to developing situations, right? You need a law responding to surrogacy. You need a law responding to, and it could be that the law needs to change. It could be the law at a certain point needs to be enforced in a certain way and later enforced in a different way. And all these things are changing.
I was too explicit the way I said it.
Right.
Yes,
Yeah.
I understand what you mean.
Okay.
I was a little bit too explicit with the way
Yeah.
I divided it up. At the end of the day, the law itself is the law itself allows and has mechanisms available to manifest into all different situations throughout human history using the Chachamim's authority and the Beit Din HaGadol and the hermeneutics to be able to draw. And I think that's the.
But that distinction, but keeping the distinction between rabbinic law and divine law is part of that, because divine law needs to be solid, needs to be unchanging, needs to be
absolute,
pure and absolute. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. That was fun.
Yeah.
I think we can skip number 5 because
Yeah.
it went into what we spoke about now.
Number 4, yeah.
Yes, number 4. So I think we can skip.
That's exactly what we discussed.
Yeah, so number 5. Okay. In the second half of Kakhol HaYam, you argue that the Rambam's theory of halakhic authority cannot be separated from his political philosophy, especially his views on courts, governance, and human perfection. What do you think is the biggest mistake modern readers make when they try to study Rambam's halakha without his philosophy, or his philosophy without his halakha?
This is a big can of worms. And for me, if we go back to Rav Rabinovitch, was one of the most important, one of his most important and central views in terms of halakha, which in contemporary times is an innovation, but I think when you look back at other poskim from different times, is less of an innovation. Is that in order to properly make halakhic decisions, the posek must understand what the Torah wants from us. Okay, and that means generally, it means we must know that generally, Torah tchilata gmilut chasadim v'sofa gmilut chasadim, that in the end of the day, the goal of the Torah is to make us good people living full lives and helping others and caring about society and actualizing the various potentials that exist in human nature, meaning understanding deeply what human nature is, understanding deeply what our powers are as human beings, and actualizing that within a society, which is what the Torah is about, and which means living life fully, which I think is something that's often missed when you get into modern halakha, is often will be why not be choshesh for various views, right? A very good example that I always use for this is borer on Shabbat. Okay, people love being machmir and borer on Shabbat because a lot of Rishonim were kind of vague about exactly what it means. The Shulchan Aruch was already very machmir about borer on Shabbat, but the Rambam was very clear about borer on Shabbat, which is actually fascinating. It's a fascinating halachic issue. I won't get into it too much, but essentially for the Rambam, borer is only with very, very small things, which don't stand alone, which don't have their own individual standing, but are always looked at as a group. Okay, the person who noted this in the Rambam was actually the Or Sameach at the end of the 19th century. He noted this in the Rambam and he wrote it. Rav Rabinovitch was always posik like this, and then very recently, within the last few years, a ta'alik, which is a summary of a shir given by the Rambam, came out in which he said there is no borer in bigger things like apples and pears, or even in nuts, but only in things like rice and sumsumin, right? Sesame seeds, which is fast. It's exactly what these interpretations were, and it's exactly what he meant, what the Or Sameach said, and for those who are machmir in this, like for instance, taking bones out of chicken, right? It has nothing to do with borer if you think about it the way the Rambam thinks about it. And the reason and many people say, okay, well, there are opinions that say it's asur, so you should not do it, okay? Which if you look individually at any specific law, it's a reasonable thing to say, right? Don't be makil, right? Like why get into an issue where there are those who said what you're doing is a very severe isser. Why get into it, okay? In any particular law, that might be the case. But when you look at the law, okay, as a whole, directing my life as a Jew, okay, what you have, it changes the character of what God is commanding me to do entirely. Okay, if I'm choshesh for all these different views, then my Shabbat will be so limited, and I'll feel nervous all the time that I'm going to Chalal Shabbat that it'll miss the point, right? And the biggest mistake made by people who study halakha without studying philosophy is not understanding that the law has a point and it needs to be precise in order to achieve its goals. And if it doesn't achieve its goals and it is not precise, it won't achieve its goals. And if I'm machmir on Hilchot Shabbat, then I'll miss the point of Shabbat. If I'm machmir on and for instance, and there's no good reason to be machmir on dinei basar b'chalav, because dinei basar b'chalav isn't some deep moral principle of the Torah. What it's a very specific technical thing which was designed to separate us from the goyim, and it was designed to prevent us from being cruel and eating an animal in its mother's milk. And so, okay, so the law of the Torah is beyond that, and the Chachamim, the law is beyond that, and that's fine. But there's no value-based reason to be choshesh for various opinions. What you need to do is determine what the law is and do what the law is. There's no point in going beyond that. Whereas, for instance, the Rambam says that a Talmid Chacham should purport himself extremely carefully in Dinei Mamonot. He should make sure that if someone owes him money, not worry about getting paid back. If he owes somebody money, to pay them back immediately, and so that he's never in debt, and that he should always be mevater, and he should always, etc., etc. Right? These laws on a personal value level mean one thing, and of course, society-wise, you can't do that because you need to have dinei mamonot. But on a personal level, if somebody owes you, 100 shekel, you can say, okay, it's not that big of a deal. He's not going to pay me back. I can be mochel this 100 shekel, and everything will be fine, and I'll be able to establish our relationship in a more positive manner, which is what the Torah is getting at. And so, the reason you can't separate the Rambam's ethical and political philosophy from halakha is that halakha is an application of ethics and politics. That's what it is.
Yeah.
And so not understanding ethics and politics is definitionally not understanding halakha. The argument, whether or not surrogacy, we go back to something we mentioned, whether or not surrogacy is a fabulous thing that God has given us through technology, or a moral blight that needs to be stopped because of the potential for abuse and because of the inherent problems in it, is a philosophical and political question. And the only way to decide it is through philosophy, through understanding ethics and politics philosophically, through thinking about these things deeply, through reading those who have written on both sides of the issue and trying to come to a reasonable human conclusion, and then trying to understand, okay, how can I find something in the Torah to give me guidance on what the law here should be? That's especially the case on it's the case on both halachot that have sources that are specifically and explicitly addressing the sources, and in halachot and especially in halachot which don't have sources, which is psikat halacha. We think about psikat halacha nowadays as deciding whether halacha should be in things that people have written about for hundreds of years. That's not psikat halacha. That's not what the Chachamim meant when they said reshut leharot. Well, it is, but it's not the only thing they meant. They also meant reshut leharot in what was already decided, which is, okay, this has been decided, this is what the law is, this is what you should do. But it also means b'shut leharot in new cases, in new issues that arise, whether or not those cases are applications which could be of one or two or three or four different dinim, or whether it's a totally new issue, right? Whether or not it's IVF and surrogacy and whatever, whether or not it's dinei kiddushin vegitin, or whether or not it's dinei Shabbat, or whether or not it's whatever it is. And without an understanding of ethics and politics, the halakha becomes a weird, misformed monstrosity. I found no other way to put it. In so many ways, because there's no thought about what we're doing to people when we make these decisions.
Rabbi Sacks actually said something about this. He was talking about how the Rav who give psak versus the communal Rav, there's like a divorce between. There's kind of like in this generation, they're kind of detached from each other. One is like behind the four walls of the Beit Midrash. He's not really understanding the needs of the people in everyday life. He's kind of removed from that. So there's like a disconnect over there. And really that's it's a shame, because you're losing out on what the halakha is meant for.
So what you're talking is another point, which is interesting. You're talking about experience versus theory. Mm-hmm. And that's also very important, because a communal rabbi who I absolutely agree with what Rabbi Sacks says, and interestingly, what I said was the way Rabbi Sacks framed something that Rav Rabinovitch said in an interview between them, which appears in the end of Rav Rabinovich's book Mesilat B'Levavam, which I think actually was just published in English as well, which is that the halakha's application of ethical principles.
Magid Publishing translated it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The halakha is the application of ethical principles. But what you need in a good leader is a combination exactly of sensitivity to what people want and need, and sensitivity to what is good and right, which aren't always the same. Mm-hmm. People may want and feel like they need a certain type of ruling, but actually need something else on the one hand. And on the other hand, what people want and need may have an outsized effect on what is actually good, right? If I feel like I need something, well, that has weight to it, which is what you're saying. So I think what you did was add another interesting and important aspect of psikat halacha, which is experience, which is understanding what the way people live their lives and how this law will affect them. Sometimes it might be that a law will have a negative effect on an individual, right? A law against surrogacy, the law against homosexual relationships. It has a devastating effect on many people. But the question is whether or not that is necessary societally or not necessary societally, whether or not you need to understand societal and sexual ethics really, really, really well to justify that and to be able to explain it and give you reasons for saying what you're saying. So on the one hand, experience and sensitivity is deeply important, but it needs to go along with
The Torah's philosophy.
right with a philosophical understanding, right?
Yeah.
So I think those are two edim which need to be for any psak.
So
I just want to say
yeah.
one thing before the next question. I think part of the reason why you have uh, halakha the way you described it in the beginning, which is kind of halakha in a vacuum,
Hmm.
divorced from ethical and political insight and uh, direction,
Right.
um, is because I really think it's a lot of it has to do with the mystical overtones that have
Yeah.
combined with halakha. Um, it's not, I'm not against mysticism per se. I'm talking about the specific type of mysticism that has seeped into halakha, right? Which has given halakha a different tone altogether,
Right.
right? And
So
so
I want to actually make that's a really important point. And I want to take issue with the way you phrase something, which again, I know you didn't mean it this way. I just want to point it out. Is there's a halakha in a vacuum. The problem with that characterization is that that's not halakha, right? Halakha was never divorced from halakha proper was never divorced from ethical and political thought and
that's what
from
I
a
meant.
conception of man,
Yeah,
right?
that's
So
what I meant.
I know exactly what you meant. I just wanted to
Okay.
take another
Yeah, yeah,
opportunity.
yeah. Make
But
sure
going
that the
right,
listeners don't
exactly.
misunderstand what I think.
But getting into the mysticism is even that wasn't in a vacuum, meaning the mystics had reasons for saying what they were saying,
Of course.
and real mystics and people who study Kabbalah deeply have a deep philosophy of man. I have a lot of friends and a lot of people I know who have mystical philosophies that I don't agree with. Okay, but they're interesting and they understand man well and they understand God and they understand the world and they have a way of looking at things. And these mystical laws that were added when they were added were never meant to just be some sort of weird like pseudo physical uh, law-based thing that you need to do tikkunim and shamayim, which are divorced from human reality. They were
Fair enough.
ways of connecting between a certain philosophy and people. Like so, even that is mystics. You're exactly correct, but it is it's even a misinterpretation of the mystics.
There's an appropriation of
Yeah,
the mystics that has resulted in a kind of um, uh, just like with Harambam, there's
right.
appropriation.
Yeah.
So too with the mystics, there's appropriation, and it just so happens that the appropriations with the mystics has has really grown over time. Like
Mhm.
it's really taken over where it's almost like halakha becomes mechanistic. That's
Yeah.
what I mean
Yeah.
in a mystical way. Not that the mystics necessarily meant it to be that way,
Right.
but that's kind of what has come about. And mysticism is there's a reason why mysticism is not supposed to be learned by everybody. There's a because these things are very very easy to misappropriate.
Right.
So
Yep.
yep,
I
I
agree.
just wanted to add that um
Absolutely agreed.
yep.
all right. So you ultimately present a model of tradition that is neither rigid nor relativistic, one that allows real human creativity while maintaining firm boundaries. Do you think this model is actually viable today, especially in the absence of a Sanhedrin, or does it reveal a tension that modern Jewish life has not yet resolved?
This is a good question, and the question is how far into speculation and possible kfira you want me to go. Um,
Feel free.
I'll go pretty far. Stop me whenever you feel like it. Um, I think I'm gonna leave the Rambam behind here for a minute, and I think that when you look at the halakha, if you in as it was, for instance, the brit with Hakadosh Baruch Hu, as it was interpreted in the Tanakh. Right? Oftentimes, the way the law was kept doesn't necessarily match halakha. The Gemara talks about these cases, right? And so there are two ways of looking at this. You can look at this as, okay, the halakha we have is the same halakha that was given to Moshe at Sinai. They put on tefillin, they read Kriyat Shema, they did all the different things. That's one view. which is the traditional view. Personally, my view is that that's not the case. That these are interpretations that develop through
Over time.
time and at later dates, and they're completely within the purview and the authority of Chachamim to innovate, and it's a good and positive and reasonable thing. Why is that little pisat kfira important? Because when you ask about the model, including both openness to change and tradition, that needs to be looked at in two aspects. One is the halacha as we know it through the Mishnah and the Talmud and the Galut, which is a halacha which developed under foreign rule and in the Galut, under foreign rule in the Mishnah and in the Galut, from sort of the late Mishnaic period and the Talmudic period, and certainly through the later developments of it. And any law that develops and changes will adapt itself to the conditions of those living and adapting that law. Dinei Mamonot, for instance, all of the end of the Mishnah Torah and all of Choshen Mishpat were developed in a very particular type of society with a very particular technology, right? They had certain technological limitations. There were relatively small groups of people. Commerce was relatively undeveloped, again, relative to modern times. And all of those facts are important in understanding that the way those aspects of halakha are today, the halakha does not have the resources to act as the Torah is supposed to act, which is as the determining and guiding law of a people in its land. And that's returning a bit to the Rambam. There are varying views on this. I'm very explicitly taking the Rambam's view. The Ran would have a different, for instance, and Joshua Taran has a different view. But the way the Rambam views the law is that the Torah is supposed to be the governing law for the Jewish people, period, on all of its aspects. The law can't do that nowadays. The Torah law cannot do that nowadays. And just on the technical changes on the side of Dinei Mamonot. That's one very classic example. Dinei Shchenim, right? The laws of neighbors. The laws, right? You have city planning nowadays, which is entirely different. Now we can argue, and we should argue, and I would love to have a discussion about the proper way to do city planning, whether or not you need zoning or you need form-based planning, whether or not, et cetera, et cetera. There are various interesting, fascinating discussions which I think can be discussed from a Torah point of view, which are important to understand. But the idea is that those aren't laws that exist. They don't exist because they couldn't have existed, right? You can't have laws about form-based planning when you're talking about ancient cities in which planning wasn't a thing, right? There were minimal laws of the relationship between the private and public, the shape of the private and public spheres and the way those interacted, just because of technological restraints, right? The streets had to look a certain way, et cetera, et cetera. All these things had to exist a certain way, and technology changes things deeply. I think that's true. For instance, I was talking with someone about Gittin v'Kiddushin. The Torah says that you need to get kritut, right? Get kritut. What's a get kritut? Would divorce papers not be a get kritut? Right? If I signed a paper and put it on an official record that exists essentially forever on the cloud or in a government server somewhere, okay, that's somehow worse than a get? Or would ki kach ish isha, could creating a status in a country's code not be good enough for those likuchin? And another example, Shabbat, okay? The melachot are designed on a particular type of society. Would gardening nowadays necessarily be a melacha? Of course it is, right? Halacha l'maaseh, of course it's a melacha. But would it be reasonable for somebody with deeper innovation to come along and say, well, no, gardening's not, because there's between doing things derech melacha and derech pnai. That's a chiluk that's a type of chiluk you would find in the Gemara. Obviously, I wouldn't make that chiluk because we don't have the authority to do so. But the deep changes that inevitably will come about in the observation of the Torah on all levels, whether or not it's a personal level, right? Does a people in its land need tefillin and kriyat shema every day? That's a good question. There's opinions in the Gemara that kriyat shema is d'Rabbanan. That's the view of in the Gemara and Brachot. Is it something that's necessary for them? Those are good questions that I believe one day will be asked, and the authority to ask them needs to exist. Now, does that exactly mean a Sanhedrin? No, but it means a Beit Din, which has the authority to do so. The Sanhedrin is a specific way of doing that Beit Din, and it's an excellent way of doing that Beit Din, and it existed historically, but could there be other ways of doing it? There may be, and the point I'm making is that we need to distinguish between the development of halakha, which is one particular way of doing the Torah, and the development of the Torah. Okay, when the development of halakha develops, it always develops, and there's sort of myth that we need a Sanhedrin to develop halakha. No, we don't need a Sanhedrin to develop halakha. Poskim develop halakha and have developed halakha for thousands of years and have done it excellently. Done an excellent job doing it from the times of the Gemara until nowadays. And halakha is very flexible. It has enormous human depth, enormous wisdom, and enormous ability to adapt itself to any given situation. However, there are types of changes which may need to come about, for instance, in Dinei Mamonot, and which may be able to come out, for instance, in the Dinei Gitin V'Kiddushin that I just mentioned. I'll give you another example. Writing a Sefer Torah. This is a funny example. There are many laws in writing Sefer Torah which are so we don't make errors, okay? The best way to not make errors is to copy the text from the internet, to find a reputable source which has a good text and to copy it and to print that, okay? Do we need to insist that they be written by hand, despite the fact that errors will always creep into something handwritten? These are questions which are beyond the purview of halakha now. They're going deeper into the Torah itself. And so when we talk about the development, no, halakha, the way it exists nowadays as a governing law of a people, but not the governing law of a state or of the political apparatus of a people. I want to make a quick aside about that. The halakha was the governing the law of the governing apparatus of the Jewish people, which was kehilot and which was independent autonomous communities and the umbrella communities. And the halakha was the governing law for the Jewish people for thousands of years, since the emancipation in Europe and since slightly later times in Eastern Europe, where Jews became part of the modern state. The governing law for the Jews has always been the law of that modern state. And then on a more personal and communal level, there's been a bit of governing from halakha, but it's changed entirely from the way it used to be. And that's important to understand, because halakha nowadays does not act as the law of the governing body of the Jewish people in any real sense. In order to adopt that role, with the understanding that most of the Jewish people live in the state of Israel, the changes it will need to undergo will demand a much broader and deeper authority than we have nowadays. I don't think it can be done without something akin to a Sanhedrin, without some sort of Beit Din that has the ability to do that. Whether, again, the question of what that actually looks like is unanswered. I think so. So I want to answer your question of whether or not it reveals attention. Modern Jewish life hasn't been resolved. Is absolutely it reveals intention, but probably not in the way that you might have thought. Meaning halakha works for what it's meant to do nowadays, which is connect people to God and keep the Jewish people in line with the covenant that we agreed upon with God at Sinai. But in order to actually be fully the Torah, halakha needs to undergo a much, much deeper change. It needs to stop being what we know as halakha and be something that in a lot of ways will be very, very, very different, I think. So both the yes and a no, I think, is an answer to that question.
I'm trying to understand a few things. So hold on.
Yeah.
And again, I do this for myself because I just want to make sure I'm understanding.
Mm-hmm.
Are you suggesting that halakha in its halakha, the way it was up until after the destruction, we lost the Sanhedrin and then we went to Galut. Are you saying that halakha, the way it was structured earlier, essentially can't ever come back to that exact state of halakha, like technically speaking?
You mean before the end of the Sanhedrin or
yes.
I don't think it should, because I think that law necessarily needs to develop with technological and societal changes.
Right.
And I think that it absolutely can. You mean like the underlying way of doing it?
Yes, the structure.
Yeah, I think the sort of, I would say maybe the constitutional structure. I absolutely think that we can, that they can and will and must return. I think that's what the emunah in the Geula means. I think the emunah in the Melech HaMashiach is that. Is
right.
much less the emunah in a specific individual, and much more the emunah in the Jewish people adopting the Torah fully as their guiding law.
And the reinstitution of the judicial process.
Precisely.
Okay, so what do you mean then when you say halakha has to change? You're talking about
The specific halachot, not the
the specific
constitutional
halachot.
aspect.
So you're saying that, okay, so what you're saying is that ideally or out of necessity, were we to hopefully bekarov establish an halakhic system, right? That a sound judicial halachic system with Sanhedrin, halakha would go through some new reforms
Yes.
based on current context. I don't even
Yeah.
think that's controversial, to be honest.
Good.
I think that's
I think the reforms would be deeper than what most people think nowadays. Meaning,
right.
yeah.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, I think so, and I think also that the constitutional structure may look different from what we see in the halachic books. Meaning, it might be vadot. How do you say vadot in English? It might be committees for the law on Shabbat that make these decisions. It instead of a specific. It might be a branch of the government. Meaning, it will be a branch of the government. Will the government necessarily look the same way it looks nowadays? Maybe it might look similar, it might look different. Meaning, modern states are run differently from pre-modern states.
Right, of course.
For
Right.
good and for bad, right? There are good, there are positive, and there are negative aspects to that. I think there are probably a lot of negative aspects to that. But again, that's a discussion in political philosophy.
Right. No, I'm not talking about, yeah, of course, in terms of the way it might practically come out. But in terms of, from what I understood, at least from Harambam,
Yeah.
is that the acceptance, the centralization
Mhm.
of halakha, centralization,
Mhm.
whereas all of Israel accept the authority is really the most important part.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, I
Yeah.
agree with that.
So
Mhm.
that is what, if we can get that part down, which we're not, at least not
We're not
yet.
there yet.
We're
Yeah.
not there yet, right? Then the technicalities of how to, that stuff, I would assume can get worked out one way or another, however it would look
Yeah.
in its modern replica or modern iteration. But it's getting all of Israel to accept the Torah as its authority with the establishing judicial
Yeah.
authorities through it.
Agreed. Yeah.
Very cool.
But I do think that it's, yeah, absolutely, I agree with everything you said, and I think it's important to add that halakha as it exists nowadays has a lot of ability to adapt. It doesn't have a deep enough ability to adapt, but it adapts well. The problem is that halakha as it's done nowadays isn't interested in adapting. It's interested in making everybody happy. It's interested in making sure that you're not stepping on any postek's toes.
Right.
It's not based on an understanding of what human beings are and what society is. And the poskim who do care about that, for instance, Rav Rabinovitch, for instance, Rav Raim nowadays might be a good example of this.
Marginalized.
Are marginalized. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. They're marginalized, and they're not taken very seriously.
Yeah, you look at a shalot v'tshuvot, in today's modern world, it's basically go through every single posek and find a way to weave through it and put it into, a way where you can make, every single posek
Right.
have its voice and, do that
Mhm.
henceforth. Okay, beautiful. Thank you. Turning to education. In Israel today, particularly within the Dati Leumi world, the dominant approach is often described as a blend of Rav Kook and Rambam, even though those systems don't always align philosophically. What do you think needs to change in the yeshiva curriculum to take Rambam seriously on his own terms, rather than treating him as one voice in a broader ideological synthesis?
So I'll tell you a funny story. Somebody asked me once how Rav Shilat, Rav Yitzchak Shilat, can be both a Rambamist and a Kooknik. And I said, he's not. He's a Kooknik, which is fine. That's a way of doing Judaism and thinking about Judaism. That's great, but he's not a Rambamist, and that's okay. There are two very different systems of thought. And for as long as I've been in Yeshiva Ma'ale Adumim, the shiurim, the curriculum of the shiurim has been Rav Kook and his sources, meaning even the Rambam and the Kuzari and the Maharal and the Rihal, which are and the Ramchal, which are sort of learned as part of the Rav Kook outlook on
Worldview.
life. Yeah,
Worldview.
which is because the the vast majority of Dati Leumi Rabbanim and teachers studied with Tzvi Yehuda Kook, which is just a fact, and that's the main reason for that. Um, what needs to change in order to take the Rambam seriously on his terms is two things. He needs to be learned independent of anybody else, and two, there needs to be an openness to philosophy within the walls of the yeshiva. I recently had the opportunity to give a lecture at a mekhina called Ein Prat, which is a mixed mekhina, both chilonim and datiim, and boys and girls. So an interesting place. And what I talked about there was the yeshiva and the university as institutions of the transmission of ways of life. I don't want to say culture. Because culture often is limited to a certain field of like entertainment, but I mean ways of living broadly. And neither the yeshiva nor the university are very aware of that fact. Meaning they're teaching what they teach. What the university teaches is modern liberalism, and what the yeshiva teaches is some brand of Judaism. And neither one comes and says, I'm offering one of several ways of life which exist nowadays, and I'm championing this as opposed to that. Meaning there's always an opposed to that. It's always there in the background. It's even mentioned often, but it's rarely done in a very self-conscious and aware kind of way. And yeshivot, as they view themselves as passing on specifically the Torah tradition, are loath to include general philosophy as part of their curricula. And there is no way to take learning the Rambam seriously without somebody teaching you Aristotle. There is no way of taking the Rambam seriously without comparing his view of man, society, and the connection between them and law with modern jurisprudential and political and ethical views. There's no way of doing that. There's no way of introducing students to a different way of looking at mankind than the common modern liberal way of looking at mankind without getting into the philosophy of that and without saying, look, this is what you think. This is what society thinks. This is what Friends think, right? The TV show Friends thinks. This is what Disney thinks. This is what X thinks. And this is what the Rambam thinks. This is what the Maharal thought. This is what Aristotle and Plato thought. This is what these various thinkers thought. And because I think this is something that the Rambam would say himself, that in order to understand what he's saying, you have to understand Aristotle. You have to understand. And I think that learning, and that personally, I think that modern Aristotelians are excellent. They're often the most insightful people I've ever read are often Catholic Thomists. And Thomists are students of Thomas Aquinas, who was mostly an Aristotelian. And they're very insightful people because they have a very deep, insightful philosophy guiding them. And they always engage with modern philosophy because they must. And I think that it would be good for yeshivot, and it would be good to understand the Rambam to at least, I'm not saying necessarily do a 3-year philosophy degree. What I'm saying is that those who teach the Rambam need to be able to articulate what people think nowadays, what Aristotle thought, and why the Rambam thinks that Aristotle makes sense, and why it makes sense in a modern society. You need to, in some way, be able to bridge that gap for your students. What I do when I teach Rambam is I do that. I will explain a view of modern philosophy and a view of Aristotelian philosophy, and how I think that Aristotelian philosophy could be reasonable nowadays. There needs to be an understanding, at least from the side of the teachers, of those various worlds, and there needs to be a grasp on the way to bridge them and at least bring them into conversation. Whether or not you accept certain modern views of man and society, which can be accepted, and you can accept Judaism. Judaism doesn't necessarily need to be pre-modern and Aristotelian, but as I think Rabbi Yohai Makbili says very well, the Rambam is a good option. And Aristotle, as the Rambam's foundation, is a very good option, and it needs to be put on the table seriously. And it needs to be done by intelligent teachers who are able to articulate well the various philosophical foundations of various ways of looking at human beings and at society. So yeah, that's what I would say about how to take the Rambam seriously.
And before we go, I do want to, that was beautiful, by the way. I do want to shout out Rabbi Jonathan Livi, mutual friend of ours. He's the one who made the shidduch, and we thank him for that. He definitely deserves a shout out.
Yeah.
And he just brought up Rav Yohai Makbili, who's also been on the podcast, about opening a new mekhina. So could you just tell us about this
Yeah.
project and the vision behind everything?
So yeah, that's something that's very near to me, very dear to my heart. Is I'm working at the moment with Rav Yochai on opening a mekhina. We're gonna at the moment it's called Hagita, from the pasuk Vayagita Bayom Balayla, which I think is a good pasuk because it was said to Yehoshua as he's entering the land, saying, "Learn the Torah so that you know how to lead the people in the land," which is what the Torah is about. And it has the word Hagut in Hebrew means philosophy, so it has an aspect of that to it as well. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to teach a Torah which is, I think, based on a lot of the principles that I discussed today, which is one an independent to building independence. The way we put it was this: that we want the Torah to be living and authentic, and to speak in a clear and accessible language, in order to lead the Jewish people moving forward, which demands that our students be deep and independent individuals. And what do I mean by each of those aspects? What I mean by a living Torah is a Torah that can develop, that can understand what society needs, and can answer those needs with a reasonable and thought out position. And in order to be able to do that, there needs to be a deep understanding of Torah sources and a deep understanding of what guides society. What I just mentioned in the previous discussion, in the previous answer, was that in order to understand the Rambam, you need to understand modern society and explain why the Rambam is a good option in order to teach the Rambam. In order to teach Judaism at all, you need to understand what modern society is based on and what the various options are. I'll present one option. Someone else will present another option. I don't mind if you have a modern Kantian who has a great idea on how to present Judaism. Great. Understand modern society, understand where we are, understand where you want to bring us to, and explain to me how these various things go together. But there must be an element of life and development and change and adaptation to the Torah. Torah needs to be adaptive and it needs to be responsive. And in order to be able to do that, it needs to understand, it needs to engage with all fields of human thought: philosophy, history, literature, science, policy, etc., etc. It needs to be authentic because the Torah has ways of thinking about things, and it has thoughts, it has content, right? There's content to the Torah. The Torah is not just right. It has ideas. It has a way of living. It's passing down a way of living, and whatever option you give philosophically, whatever option you give as part of the living Torah, it needs to be authentic to the laws of the Torah, to the stories of the Torah, to the ideas that lay behind all of those. And it needs to speak in a clear, accessible language, which is something that Rav Rabinovitch actually was very important to Rav Rabinovitch, and which is very important to Rav Yochai. Rav Yochai's work on the Rambam has been dedicated to making the Rambam accessible and presenting him as a good option, as a reasonable, deep, thoughtful option to modern individuals. And he's an absolute master at speaking in a clear and accessible language. Story about Rav Rabinovitch before I let you guys go. When he was younger, when Rav Rabinovitch was younger, he wrote in a very yeshivish type of language. His tshuvot from when he was in America and London have they're unique in their content because he's a very unique thinker. But their language was classic yeshivish Achroni jargon. And if you read the Yad Pshuta, his later commentary on the Rambam, it's written in clear and accessible Hebrew. And I asked him about this. I said, well, why did you change? Was this intentional or did it just sort of happen? He said, oh, it was absolutely intentional. He said, when I made Aliyah, I thought about what Israeli society needs going forward. And I decided that it needs Torah being written in clear, modern, accessible Hebrew, just like the Rambam would have done. He said, it took me a little while to figure it out, but I think I got it figured out after the early Yad Pshuta. He said, you'll notice the early Yad Pshuta still has a little bit of the Achroni vibe to it, but I think I got it down later. And that's one of Rabinovitch's main messages to us, his students, was always speak clearly, know how to articulate yourself, understand what you're saying, so you can understand what you're thinking. Those two things are deeply, deeply connected. He said people would come up to him and say things that they don't. He would, one of his rejoinders in conversations would be like, I don't know what you mean, and I don't think that you know what you mean either. Um, and
I get that a
that's
lot.
so often the case because those two go together. And so our educational vision is one is that it's to present a living Torah, an authentic Torah that speaks in a clear, accessible language, and of course to offer the Rambam as a leading contender in the renewal of Jewish thought and law. And we hope to be able to do that. We're at the stage where we need funding. So if anyone knows any millionaires, connect us to them.
Right,
We're
that's why you're on a podcast now. Hopefully,
yeah,
it gets to the right ears,
We'll
and
get
if
to
it
the
gets
right
the right
ears.
ideas,
Exactly.
we're at the stage where we're looking for founding donors, meaning we're looking for donors who can help us get to about 1 million shekel a year for the first 2 or 3 years of activity, because there's no government funding until you existed for 2 or 3 years and shown that you're successful. Um, so yeah, if anybody can connect us to anyone who would be of help in that field, that would be fantastic.
well, this what you just said is music to my ears because I think that's just I wish I could go to yeshiva like that. That just like
We need it.
and we
Yeah,
need it, even in American society, I always hear about the fact that they used to teach logic in public schools. I'm like, wow, that's amazing. Why do we
yeah.
move away from that? And it's kind of refreshing to hear that people like yourself and Rav Makbili are are trying to show that this is all knowledge is Torah, because Torah is instruction for life. So ultimately, we're going to need to know how to apply, the law to, the changes that are happening with AI and all these different things.
Hmm.
And this is the only kind of place where I see people would really,
Engage with that.
engage with that. Yeah, so
Yeah,
that's very exciting, and we wish you a lot of success, and
appreciate it.
hopefully from this podcast we'll get some fans.
Yeah,
Amen.
thanks. I always appreciate the opportunity to speak about my ideas a bit. So I appreciate you guys having me on.
We appreciate you.
Yeah.
Thank you
Thank you
so
so
much.
much.
Yeah. Have a good night.
Hatzlacha. Be in
Take care.
touch.
I will.